The Business Journal Roundtable Series is sponsored by Advanced Technology Partners.
I joined the Mahoning River Consortium in 1996. That was when Congressman Trafficant was spearheading the effort with the hope of securing $100 million from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to do a full 33-mile river dredging project. At that time, it was a core group of representatives from the various institutions, YSU, the cities, the counties, engineer departments, and so forth. 50 years ago, there was about 25 million gallons of contaminants being dumped into the river each day. Everybody's heard that number, yes. Some of it was raw sewage, some of it was industrial contaminants. 50 years ago, the state of Ohio went after the industry to clean up the river. And we all know the history, the follow-on history of that, which was the steel mills went away. And then the river was just left contaminated. And it was really about 20 years ago in the early 2000s that the Mahoning River Consortium, along with the Army Corps of Engineers, marshaled enough money to do those necessary studies and reconnaissance work that had to be done. A lot of trips to the river, a lot of things like that. And the Army Corps encouraged us to build community support for that initiative, which we did. We secured a lot of grants from the Ohio EPA and the US EPA to do school-based curricula. And Holly Burnett Hanley had spearheaded those efforts, and she did a wonderful job connecting the core downtowns with the river and allowing young people to see what the possibilities were around all that. River fests began around that time. 1998 was the first one, and then they continued year on year. And there were groups like Leadership Youngstown that took on the river and things like that. So the shift started about 20 years ago, where people began to see, began to kayak, began to understand that the river has potential. A commission was studied by the MRC through the Cleveland State University, which found that $30 million a year of benefits could be realized with a clean river. And information like that went on to really build that support. We established the Mahoning River Corridor Initiative, which focused on the lands along the corridor of the rivers, because those were all now brownfields and contaminated. And you're not going to access the river if you can't walk on those nasty brownfields. So about 20 years ago, there was an initiative to clean up all the brownfields along the river, to keep the riparian corridor intact as much as possible, because the trees serve a purpose. Those were the kinds of visions that began around 2000, 2005, somewhere in there. We formulated the Mahoning River Corridor Mayors Association around that time, because it became important, in order to secure funding, to have the kind of leadership support and to show that we can get along between the communities. This region was settled by along the banks of that river for a good reason, and our revitalization largely hinges on getting back to the banks along the Mahoning River. And in my role at the Eastgate Regional Council of Governments and Economic Development, we had a vision with the Army Corps of Engineers to have economic development stand side by side with conservation and recreation, and have them woven together in the model of the Richard, Florida revitalization that was going on at the time. The Army Corps got as far as a feasibility study, which basically gave us models of how to clean up the river. When the Youngstown State University faculty reviewed the proposed model, no one was in love with it. It didn't seem to serve what we were hoping it would. Simultaneous with that, the US EPA went to the Army Corps of Engineers and said, well, you have CERCLA liabilities there. And I know I'm getting boring and techie here, but
No, you're good.
the CERCLA is the Comprehensive Environmental Liability Act, which then told us we had to have to go back to the 33 river miles, trace who had done the polluting in the past, and file legal action against them for recovery. That was not a reasonable action. And so we parted from the Army Corps as friends. And that was 20 years ago. And then along with that, it began the dam removal. And there was this Watershed Restoration Act funding coming through the state, that if one community did a water cleanup project, instead of paying interest on the loans to the city or to the state, those monies could go toward a cleanup project, and that is how the dams are cleaned up. And no one understands how the money flows, so don't worry. But the dams held 80% of the contaminants. And so everyone said, well, why not clean up the sediments behind the dams, get 80% of it done, and let the rest of it flow and nature take its course. And that has been the rest of history, you might say, on the cleanup of the river. But we continue to have the mayors meet and identify and advocate for those kinds of causes that each city shares, both economic development, recreational, and community development oriented. And it was the Mahoning River Consortium that really began to develop all these little different initiatives to create more community support and awareness around the river. And then Eastgate took over with a riverwide plan, much more formal action, which was much needed at the time.
The Business Journal Roundtable Series is sponsored by Advanced Technology Partners.